Welcome back to Palestine Bookshelf. I'm Stephen Heiner, and today we're going to be discussing Truman the Politician and the Establishment of Israel by Lawrence Davidson. This is a 2010 article that appeared in the Journal of Palestine Studies. I'll put a link to it in the description. We've discussed Truman before and his role in various reviews, probably most recently in What Price Israel by Alfred Lililenthal. I'll put a link to that in the description as well as a card. This goes, I wouldn't say slightly deeper. It gives you a bit more context than Mr. Lilienthal is able to do in his book for understanding why Truman made the decision that he did. And you have to realize, without this speedy recognition, de facto recognition of Israel, moments, in a sense, after it unilaterally declares its statehood, its independence, the path to recognition for Israel is much harder. But because the Israel lobby was working even before the establishment of the State of Israel, you have this fast recognition. This short article gives you some deeper background, deeper context to understand how Truman was motivated. It's not a long article, and in fact, I'm going to read you pretty significant excerpts from it. So I think after you hear what I read out, you'll still want to read the article in full, but I think you'll get a better sense of what I'm talking about. So we start at the very beginning of the article. After holding the office of vice president for only 82 days, Harry S. Truman became president of the United States on the 12th of April, 1945. It was a sign of U.S. Zionist activism and influence that it took the Palestine issue only 6 days, until the 18th of April, to come to his official attention. It did so in the form of a memo from Secretary of State Edward Stettinius. The memo read in part, "It is likely that efforts will be made by some Zionist leaders to obtain from you commitments in favor of unlimited Jewish immigration into Palestine and the establishment of a Jewish state. As you are aware, the government and the people of the United States have every sympathy for the persecuted Jews. The question of Palestine is, however, a highly complex one, and, therefore, I believe you would probably want to call for full and detailed information on the subject before taking any particular position. There is continual tenseness in the situation, and we have interests in the area which are vital to the United States. We feel that this whole subject is one that should be handled with the greatest care." I don't think there's anything objectionable about what the Secretary of State is writing. And Mr. Davidson comments here, "On the face of it, this communication was simply informing the new president of a sensitive situation touching on U.S. national interests in the Middle East. However, Truman read much more into it. Indeed, he reacted to Stettinius's words as if they were an unwanted lecture from a source for whom he had little respect. The striped pants boys warned me, in effect, to watch my step. They thought I really didn't understand what was going on over there." Well, that was correct. Why should Harry Truman have reacted in this fashion? The strengths and weaknesses of personality, personal ambition, the choice of advisors, and the conditioning effects of past experiences are at the root of his reaction. Truman was a man whose political appetite grew with the eating. He was a politician who had come up the political ladder one rung at a time, holding office at county, state, and national levels. At least until he got to the White House, he was able to master each of his offices in succession. Truman had learned how to be a politician under the tutelage of Boss Tom Pendergast. Boss Tom ran the Democratic Party machine in Jackson County, Missouri, and had recruited him for the elected post of a county judge in 1922. As Truman progressed to higher office, the habit of operating as a machine politician never left him. He once told an audience that a politician is a man who understands government, and it takes a politician to run a government. A statesman is a politician who has been dead 10 or 15 years. And within that context, as a machine politician, you just give orders and people execute them. But in the role of president, you have to be able and willing to take advice and counsel, and you have to accept that you don't know everything about every subject, and you can't possibly know that. And you're not elected simply to make decisions based on your gut. You need to educate yourself about particular things before you make a decision. And you certainly don't want to make decisions based on emotion, pride, anger. His pride, combined with his political ambition, caused Truman quickly to set his sights on becoming president on his own merits come the 1948 elections. Because he had become president because FDR had died, he wanted to become president in his own right. Again, pride. This was important to Truman because despite his straight-talking and take-command behavior, he was really an insecure personality. One can probably trace this to his lower middle-class economic origins and the need to improve himself so as to become eligible to marry the woman he loved. His wife Bess came from a wealthy family that had looked down on him and initially opposed the marriage. Truman's courtship was long and difficult and full of striving to prove himself to Bess, her family, and himself. It left him with a lifelong need to prove that he could beat the other fellow even when the other fellow was richer and better connected than he was. Getting elected president must have seemed the ultimate test to Harry Truman. It was one he could not resist. And this is something that we see with President Trump as well. Deep insecurity, the need to be validated, the need to be told how great he is. And these are not really the people you want ruling over you, because these are not people who serve from a place of generosity, where they don't care what they're called. They don't need to be told how wonderful they are all the time. They're just there to serve the people. And that's so rare in leadership, not just in the United States, but in many other places as well. If you'd like to listen to a review I did on President Trump via a Bob Woodward book, I'll put a link in the description as well as a card. By the 1940s, most of the domestic U.S. political establishment was allied to one or other Zionist organization. Thus, even if Truman was not consciously picking aides and advisors sympathetic to Zionism, the probability would be good that he would get such people in any case. And he did. These advisors, in turn, created an information environment for the president that exaggerated the importance of the so-called Jewish vote for the next presidential election. They convinced Truman that all U.S. Jews favored a Jewish state in Palestine, which was not true, and that the support of these same Jews was vital for realizing his electoral ambitions. If I didn't already mention, I'd put a link for Alfred Lilienthal's book. I'll do that. If you're enjoying this content, please consider hitting like, subscribe. It's a free way that you can support the channel and gets this content out to other people who might be interested. The principal State Department actors in this drama were Near East and African Affairs head Loy Anderson, Secretary of State George C. Marshall. Stettinius had resigned in June 1946, and his assistant Robert Lovett. Marshall had been the U.S. Army's Chief of Staff during World War II, and was the man Winston Churchill had called the organizer of victory in that conflict. In the conflict between the White House and State Department over Palestine, it was Henderson who most often represented the department's position. Palestine policy, he asserted, should not only be guided by U.S. national interest in the Arab world, but also stay in tune with U.S. democratic traditions. In our considered opinion, the active support by the government of the United States of a policy favoring the setting up of a Jewish state in Palestine would be contrary to the policy which the United States has always followed of respecting the wishes of a large majority of the local inhabitants with respect to their form of government. At the present time, the United States has a moral prestige in the Near and Middle East unequaled by that of any other great power. We would lose that prestige and would likely for many years be considered a betrayer of the high principles which we ourselves have enunciated during the period of the war. All true. Henderson was, of course, correct from a foreign policy point of view, but for the White House and the Congress as well, Palestine was no longer a foreign policy issue. In a letter dated the 24th of July, 1945, Truman had laid out the U.S. politician's perspective on Palestine to Churchill. There is a great interest in America in the Palestine problem. The drastic restrictions imposed by the British on Jewish immigration into Palestine continue to provoke passionate protests from Americans. This popular concern had been building for a long time, certainly ever since the 1922 Joint Congressional Resolution in support of the Balfour Declaration. And so by Truman's presidency, all U.S. political decisions on the subject turned on the strength of Zionist-influenced domestic political calculations. For instance, when it came to Henderson's concern about respecting the wishes of a large majority of the local inhabitants with respect to their form of government, President Truman, along with most other Americans paying attention to the Holy Land, had perceptually depopulated Palestine of its Arab inhabitants and replaced them completely with Zionist settlers. So Truman tells us in his memoirs, The Balfour Declaration, promising the Jews the opportunity to reestablish a homeland in Palestine, had always seemed to me to go hand in hand with the noble policies of Woodrow Wilson, especially the principle of self-determination. As to the Palestinian Arab majority's own right to self-determination, which Henderson took seriously, President Truman literally dismissed it. When referring to such rights in his memoirs, he always put the reference in quotation marks. Remember, it was an empty land, and he actually believes that. While unsettled by the escalating violence in Palestine, President Truman seemed unable to understand his own role in bringing it about. He blamed everyone but himself and the Zionists. Thus, this is something else he shares with President Trump. Thus, he blamed the UN for failing to create an international police force, and blamed the Arabs for having flatly refused to work to preserve peace and practice moderation. Then Truman did something that greatly complicated his position. Breaking his own rule about not meeting with any more Zionist lobbyists, he received the Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann at the White House on the evening of the 18th of March 1948. Truman did this at the behest of his longtime Jewish friend Edward Jacobson, who in turn had been recruited to intervene with the president by Zionist members of B'nai B'rith. Apparently forgetting his agreement with the State Department to revive the trusteeship option in the event of chaos in Palestine, so as an alternative to partition. Truman personally assured Weizmann that the U.S. government would support partition without qualification. Unfortunately, but typically, Truman did not inform the State Department of this personal pledge, or even that he had seen Weizmann. When on the 19th of March 1948, with violence and mayhem besetting Palestine, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Warren Austin, moved to suspend partition and announced his country's shift of support to temporary trusteeship, Truman exploded in anger. "This morning, I find that the State Department has reversed my Palestine policy. The first I know about it is what I see in the papers. Isn't that hell? I'm now in the position of a liar and a double-crosser. I've never felt so in my life." Truman seems never to have considered how his own failure to inform the State Department of his dealings with Weizmann contributed to his predicament. The State Department was acting according to a pre-approved script and had no way of knowing that Truman, in his conversation with the Zionist leader, had changed that script. Ruling and governing is not simple. It's complicated. It involves different people. And you can't just unilaterally make a decision and then blame someone else when you go against something that you had already set up. Truman, very much like Trump, wants to take credit when things go well, and when things go badly, he blames others. Despite having a plaque, which I've seen when I've gone to his presidential library, it would sit on his desk, "The buck stops here." So he has this reputation of, I take responsibility for everything, but you can see, even with this issue, that wasn't the case. Like so many other U.S. politicians, Truman had been encouraged by a combination of Zionist propaganda and popular anti-immigration sentiment to see Palestine as the only viable solution to the problem of Europe's surviving Jewish displaced persons. This being the case, Truman could convince himself that his policy of support for the Zionist cause was not merely a function of political expediency or religious bias, but rather a humanitarian policy. The fate of the Jewish victims of Hitlerism was a matter of deep personal concern to me. Their plight was a challenge to Western civilization, and as president I undertook to do something about it. One of the solutions being proposed was a national Jewish home. The use of the word "one" here was disingenuous. Truman never seriously considered any alternative solution. He described Palestine as the land which represents for so many of them their only hope of survival. Truman had no right to give Palestine to anybody. Let's remind this over and over. Palestine was not anybody's land to give. It was not the United Nations. It was not Britain's. It was not America's. Truman is acting as though he has the ability to do something that he didn't have the ability to do. This assertion begs the question of the U.S. immigration laws that had kept most of the victims of the Nazis, including Jewish refugees, from coming to the United States throughout World War II. As a U.S. Senator, Harry Truman had supported those laws for political reasons. As president, he had made a half-hearted effort to liberalize the immigration laws, but because of the negative popular reaction, he had not pushed hard. Simply put, humanitarianism was trumped by domestic politics. A Jewish state in Palestine, on the other hand, with its positive domestic political benefits, was an open field for humanitarian gestures. In addition, Truman connected the Palestine solution to the solemn promise given in the Balfour Declaration and his conviction that this promise should be kept, just as all promises made by responsible civilized governments should be kept. But how can you keep a promise that you have no moral right to make? You can't make a promise about land that you don't own to another people who aren't from there. So, as I say, it's not a long article. I encourage you to check it out. If you don't have a subscription to the Journal of Palestine Studies, I encourage you to get one. It's well worth it. It's full of interesting articles, not just the articles now, but articles like this one back from 2010. Obviously, it'll be impossible to ever catch up, but small articles like this I think are well worth your time. If you'd like to support the channel, please hit like, subscribe, share this with people who'd like to know more about what's going on in Palestine and what has really been going on, as opposed to what the mainstream media tells you. If you'd like to get a copy of this, as I say, there's a link to that in the description. If you want to thank me for this presentation, consider sending buy me a coffee or a PayPal. There's links to that in the description, as well as a link to Patreon and YouTube membership. It's a way that you can support the channel on an ongoing basis, get access to early releases of videos like this one, chat with me behind the scenes, get exclusive member content that I don't upload to YouTube or other channels. If you'd like to nominate a book for the future, please navigate down to the Amazon wish list, which is in the description. There you'll see different books. Obviously, the ones for Palestine are for the Palestine Bookshelf channel, but you'll see other books. Those are for my main Stephen Heiner channel. If you'd like to check that out, I do reviews on stuff that is not related to Palestine. And a reminder that once this channel gets monetized, all the profits will go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, wonderful charity. There's a link to them in the description. Go check them out. Support them directly. But if you'd like to support them indirectly, watch as many videos as you can to get us to monetization. They help Palestinian children get medical care who could not otherwise get it. Until next time, enjoy your reading.